Hello and welcome to everyone here, our students, alumni, and members of our professional chapter. Thank you for joining us. My name is Austin Merkel, and I am a professional programs associate here at the Alexander Hamilton Society. For those who are joining us for the first time, AHS is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization, seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into the foreign policy and national security careers imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong and principled American leadership in global affairs. We operate on college campuses across the country. We now have nearly 2,500 alumni, many of whom are working in the foreign policy and national security space. And we host professional gatherings in New York and Washington through our professional chapters. If you are interested in learning more about what we do and to get involved, please visit our website, alexanderhamiltonsociety.org, and we'd love to connect with you. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome, as part of our America's Role in the World book series, Michael O'Hanlon, who is the Philip H. Knight Chair in Defense and Strategy and the Director of Research in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, to discuss his recently released book, To Dare Mighty Things, U.S. Defense Strategy Since the Revolution. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to start with your approach to such an encompassing topic, especially because our nation's 250th birthday is a natural chance to reflect and discuss the lessons of our history. So first, a central theme is the question of our strategic culture, whether we have a coherent strategic culture, how that's changed through our history, something that you describe as assertive. How did you arrive at that description, and can you expand on some of the enduring patterns through our history that have defined it?
Yeah, Austin, and hi, everybody. Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and still new year to everybody. When I began the book, I wasn't looking to make an argument. It wasn't one of these books where I had the thesis first and then did the research to back it up. I really started out wanting to do a chronology to understand American defense strategy throughout the whole 250 years. It just seemed like a good time to do that, given the birthday, the commemoration of 1776, and given that my previous book was a history of America's major wars, so I'd already focused a lot on wartime strategy. And I thought, therefore, I had sort of a head start thinking about peacetime and wartime strategy interwoven with each other. And then finally, as I'm getting into my 60s and not yet thinking of retiring, but getting a little nostalgic about, my time in Washington, I realized that I started working in the DC area in the summer of 1989. So I've been here for the entire post-Cold War period. And I studied the Cold War intensively during grad school. So I already had sort of two of the big chunks of time that I felt I understood pretty well and had been really part of the debate since 1989. So that's part of the motivation. And I'm getting to your question here in a second, but I just want to underscore that my first task was not to prove a point. It was to look at the history. And just as a defense analyst myself, understand the background of our country's current situation better. Because like William Faulkner said, the past is never forgotten. In fact, it's not even past. Today's policy debates derive from all the things that got us here. So history is not some academic discipline about what happened in yesteryear. History should be thought of as what brought us to the present and what shapes our choices and our character and our possibilities today. So I thought it was important to try to look for patterns. And then if I could, I'll do a riff off Alexander Hamilton because of the nature of your society. And with apologies in advance, it's not all flattering about him, but it does get to my thesis because I looked at the United States even in the 1790s. And my impression of the United States in the 1790s from the history I learned in high school and from the occasional reading I would do about that period over my adult life is that it was a period when we were just really focused on ourselves internally. And of course, Hamilton did play a great role as Secretary of the Treasury, deciding or convincing people to federalize debt from the Revolutionary War, to tie the colonies more tightly together. He was a federalist, both in the proper sense of that party's name, but also in the general concept of wanting to strengthen the United States as a single country, not as 13 United States in the plural, which is how they were often talked about back then. But here's something about Hamilton's subsequent life that surprised me and drove home just how assertive Americans have always been, even in foreign policy and even in the early days, even with the first decade of our consolidation as a government and, with the Congress and the presidency beginning in 1789 and Hamilton becoming Secretary of the Treasury back then. But then about 1797, when John Adams is now president, and Thomas Jefferson's the vice president, not because he's of the same party or a political ally as Adams, but because he was the runner-up. And back then, the runner-up got the number two job. And people were saying, let's build a federal army again, which we had basically dismantled almost entirely after the Revolution. And the reason was we were in a quasi-war or a half-war with France because France was harassing our shipping and having pirates under letters of marque harass our shipping in the Caribbean because we were trading with Britain. And France, of course, was at war with Britain again. And so even though France had been our ally and helped us get our independence in the 1780s, at this point, they were closer to our enemy. And we decided to build also a new navy, 6 frigates that were authorized and ultimately completed that were going to be to deal with the Barbary pirates, but then later France. But some people, and I'll sorry for the long story, but I think people will find this interesting if they're in an Alexander Hamilton society. Some people really wanted to build a 10,000 soldier strong federal army or even bigger to deal with insurrections, but maybe also to do other things. And people started clamoring for poor old George Washington, who had finally gotten his retirement and finally been able to move back to Mount Vernon after spending 8 years in Philadelphia and much of the previous 15 years on the road as well. They're asking Washington to come lead this army. And Washington says, fine, I'll be the figurehead, but I want Alexander Hamilton to be my chief of staff, which means effectively that he would be the field commander because I'm going to stay at Mount Vernon. And John Adams and Thomas Jefferson did not really like each other very well in this point in their lives. They later became pen pals after they were both president and both returned to Massachusetts and Virginia and had a famous relationship by long distance courier until their deaths the same day, July 4th, 1826, just too uncanny to be true. But in this period of time, 1797, 1798, even though they were co-inhabiting the executive branch, they were rivals and of different political parties. But they agreed on one thing. They did not like or trust Alexander Hamilton. And they thought he was ambitious, which I think most of us would agree, whether we're fans or not, and vainglorious and dangerous, that if he were given command of a new federal army that became instantaneously the most powerful ground force in North America, there was no telling what he would do with it. We hadn't really established good civilian control of the military. We didn't have telephones and telegraphs and other ways to keep in close contact between Washington and the field. And Adams and Jefferson thought if you gave Hamilton this army, he might go take Florida from Spain or even invade Mexico, which at that point was still under Spanish control. And so when Adams had a chance to sign a deal with France, he kept building the Navy, but he killed the idea of the army and took the peace deal largely because he really didn't want to run the risk of Alexander Hamilton having all this power and such a big force. So I don't mean to put it all on Hamilton, but it's a fun story about the different personalities and the rivalries and even the intense disagreements and dislikes among some of the founding fathers and early political leaders of the United States. But it was from the get-go that we were already thinking, what military forces do we need to go off and do what I call mighty things? The title comes from a Theodore Roosevelt speech 100 years later. But, we were already looking to expand beyond the 13 colonies. We were not just consolidating ourselves as a country. And much of the consolidation, of course, or much of the expansion wound up going westward and taking land from Native Americans and then ultimately from Mexico. But there was really never a moment of peace and tranquility in our foreign policy or our defense strategy. So I promise all the rest of my answers will be shorter than that one, but that's sort of a way to give you a window into the book, how it came about, and my overall argument that Americans are today and always have been an extremely assertive people. We are a good people. We are not a peaceful people, in my reckoning.
So I think that's a nice segue into, I'd like to discuss the title and it sort of being about an attitude pervasive through American history. It's from the Roosevelt's strenuous life speech, which is also, I think, a word that you could use for America's growth and its defense posture with that assertiveness. Could you, I want to drill down a little bit more on the revolution and the foundational question of a standing army, because both our experiences in that revolution, the military leaders' experiences, as well as their experience with fighting under British command in prior engagements, how the revolution necessarily sets the tone for what America became and what our defense posture became. How did that foundational question of a standing army evolve once we got it to set the tone for our later challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question. The U.S. Army, the federal army, as opposed to the state militias that could be brought into federal service when necessary, the standing federal army really only numbered single-digit thousand soldiers all the way up to the War of 1812. And even then, it didn't grow that much, and it just grew temporarily. We never really had a big army until the Civil War. Even the U.S.-Mexico War, where we launched a big amphibious operation from New Orleans to Veracruz, Mexico, and then mounted into the Mexican highlands and ultimately took Mexico City under General Winfield Scott in 1847. Even that operation took 15,000 soldiers, not more. And so we were always, throughout this first half of our history, with the exception of 1861 to 1865, we were always a very small ground force. The numbers crept up, but they crept up surprisingly slowly. So I think it was 1821 when John Calhoun developed a plan for an expandable army that would have, as I recall, 6,000 permanent soldiers, but a way to rapidly double that with people who had already been pre-selected and given some kind of role, essentially a reserve force, a federal reserve. Most of our reserve capabilities were through National Guard militias at the state level. But we did have that plan in the Calhoun, era for a somewhat bigger army. But yeah, bear in mind those numbers. The Calhoun plan of expansion of the army was going to get up to 6,000 with the possibility of adding 6,000 more quickly. That was an expansion of where things were otherwise in that period of time. Because when we fought Native Americans, which we did all the time, of course, and it's obviously an ethically complex set of issues to wrestle with. And, in this book, I observe the ethical quandary. I don't spend a lot of time dealing with it because the book's about strategy, military strategy. And, people say in the modern era, we're pretty bad at counterinsurgency. I'm not going to say the Native Americans fighting for their own land was insurgency, but it was a kind of warfare that often involved hit and run, ambush, irregular forces that were hard to find. And therefore, it did have certain similarities to counterinsurgency warfare. And I have to say, the United States was pretty good at it. And for 100 years, that's how we took the whole country from the Native American populations of the day. And, we were ruthless. We figured out ways to divide and conquer, get some tribes to work with us against other tribes, to sometimes just cut off their access to their food as a way to force them to surrender, or sometimes take their women and children hostage for the same purpose. And we would often make deals that sort of divvied up whatever land had been at issue, and then a couple of years later break the deal as we expanded restlessly westward. And so we were, unfortunately, or whatever, the ethics are, again, troublesome, but we were pretty good at figuring out how to push Native Americans off their land. And we did it, however, with hundreds of forces at a time, typically, and at most low thousands. Because, of course, the Native American tribes were generally not organized into big formations themselves. There was a Shawnee Confederacy in the early 1800s that Tecumseh led, and that William Harrison wound up defeating in battle, and that some of that was woven into the War of 1812. So there were times where we had somewhat bigger encounters, but even those were typically mid to high hundreds of soldiers on a side, not more. So we were brutally efficient with our ground forces throughout the whole first half of our history.
Related to, I think, staying on the theme of early expansion, something that was clarifying for me in your book was how, I think both for studying history and thinking about policy, was how your book treats the difference, but the relationship between grand strategy and defense strategy. I think early grand strategy, as you described, has a lot to do with territorial expansion. Americans considered fish and friends to be their natural barriers. But what lessons from the Revolutionary War and those early expansion times were most lasting for defense policymakers? And I guess how has the relationship between defense policy and grand strategy evolved when I think ostensibly grand strategy should always go first? Are our
Yeah.
mistakes when we invert those?
Well, first of all, that's a great question, but let me have a little bit of fun first with the premise or with one of the side comments you made along the way. You said we thought our natural barriers were fish and friends, but we actually, in our early history, fought Canada and Mexico. And
Sure.
so they were not friends at first. In fact, they were victims. They never attacked us, but we attacked them. Now, Canada was not an independent country until into the middle 19th century. So we were really fighting Britain when we fought in Canada. But that involved the Revolution, the War of 1812, and then, sort of tussling for influence out west, ultimately satisfied or resolved by the Oregon Territory Treaty of 1846. And then, of course, Mexico we invaded in 1846, as well as in 1914, 1916. And so it took a while for these countries to become friends. And apparently both of them are pretty good at forgiveness since they had reason not to be friends with us. And maybe that's a foreshadowing of where we are today. Who knows? We'll come back to that if you wish in the discussion of current events. But grand strategy, I define very simply as the pursuit of national security, but also the pursuit of national power. Now, since we have a lot of academics, I'm sure, in the group, and people who have taken different courses from different IR theorists and read different definitions, some people will define grand strategy as just the pursuit of national security, making yourself safe as a nation. But I don't think that explains the United States very well, because in that first half of our history in particular, we were trying to get bigger. And our security interests were not about protecting ourselves. They were about amassing power and territory and resources and wealth, not so much with an eye towards dominating the world militarily at some future date, but more because we wanted to build a big new country with a new concept of government dedicated to the proposition that all are created equal, even if we didn't live up to that until the early 20th century, or maybe still not today. And otherwise, with a big resource base, we wanted to build a prosperous and successful country. And so I think our grand strategy has to be defined not only as making ourselves safe, but making ourselves more powerful. And that's why I say for our first half of our history, it was expansionism, territorial expansionism, as you say. Defense strategy is the way you use the military in pursuit of grand strategy, the way your military budgets, forces, operations, deployments, allies, the way all these things, which are instruments of military power in one sense, how they all contribute to grand strategy. And by the way, I don't get too caught up in theoretical or academic discussions about the distinction between these two or how to determine which was our strategy at a given moment in time. As you know, today we always write new strategies, every administration. So the Trump administration unveiled its national security strategy in late 2025 and its national defense strategy just last week. And in a sense, the national security strategy is sort of like the grand strategy. And the national defense strategy is sort of like the military strategy, the subject of my book. But I don't give a lot of attention to documents when I'm trying to define and describe our grand strategy or our military strategy. I look at our behavior because I think that these documents are sometimes not really our strategies. Either they are meant to be public relations documents that tell people how we want them to perceive us more than how we really are planning our future military operations, or they are sort of bureaucratic and internal political documents trying to reshape Pentagon priorities or nudge the needle a little bit towards focusing on China or what have you. They're not really always comprehensive strategies. And in the modern era, they often read like the kitchen sink has been thrown in, where every little interest and every little tool of power is somehow incorporated in a long document. In that regard, while I don't like a lot of what's in the Trump documents, I will give them credit. I'll even give Secretary Hegseth credit with his defense strategy for focusing on a narrower set of problems in a shorter document that therefore feels, in some sense, slightly more strategic. I may not always agree with what he's saying, but I think he follows a little bit more of that logic. But of course, he's also serving a political agenda, pleasing his president, portraying the president the way the president wants to be portrayed. So the 2026 National Defense Strategy is helpful for understanding our current defense strategy. It's not the only thing, and it may not even be the most important thing. And through history, we usually didn't even have those kinds of documents, at least not every administration. We'd have some kind of a big manual on how to fight the Native Americans, or we'd have a powerful debate in the Senate on whether to declare war on Mexico or something like that. And that could sort of, if you unpack that, you could find national defense strategies and grand strategies within that sort of emerge from the conversation. They're not formally written down as such. So grand strategy is the pursuit of national security and national power. Defense strategy or military strategy is the use of military instruments to serve that grand strategy.
So I'd like to follow up on maybe the role of the public communication of the strategies, especially because you've got a historical look at some things that American people are used to seeing every year, every administration, in many parts of the political process, but specifically defense, wasn't always the case. So how, throughout our history, have we evolved in how we communicate our defense goals to our own public, and how we engage public opinion, especially because so many of the successful defense strategies that you research involve whole of society efforts or larger efforts than just the military?
Yeah, nice question. Well, there were some occasions where we had a big debate because we were thinking about going to war. And in the first half of our history, we took the Constitution more seriously and literally, that Congress had to declare war before we embarked on some big new thing. And it didn't mean we always made the right decision or that we always made a peaceful decision, but we at least forged some kind of consensus. So you see that in the prelude to the War of 1812, where we declared war early on against Great Britain. You see that in the prelude to the US-Mexico War and the Spanish-American War. Those were all three declared wars where both houses of Congress voted by majority to authorize the president to use military force against a given country. In fact, they did more than authorize the use of force. They formally initiated a state of hostilities, even though the president, of course, is the commander-in-chief. The only vote that was close, by the way, was the War of 1812 vote, where a lot of Federalists in New England didn't really want to go to war with their good trading buddy in the form of Great Britain. And so that wound up being less lopsided, but it was still a clear vote in favor of war. Yet at other times, and maybe more importantly, or most importantly, in thinking about how we dealt with the Native Americans, we, did that by appropriating enough money to build a big enough force to go out and do what needed to be done next. And if we had a setback, like with General George Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, Custer's last stand, where he was killed, of course, we then just built up a bigger force and went out and tried again and succeeded the next time. That was basically the pattern. And sometimes there were more formal decisions, like with Andrew Jackson and the so-called Trail of Tears, whereby a lot of the remaining Native American populations on the eastern third of the country were pushed into the plains by a deliberate forced migration policy, which was brutal and, heart-wrenching and often fatal for the Native Americans themselves. So sometimes there were policies that we debated and authorized, appropriated funds for. But quite often there was just this general sense that was almost unspoken, or sometimes captured by pithy newspaper writers like the guy who coined the phrase manifest destiny in 1845 that sort of explained why we thought there was this inevitability about going west. Generally speaking, there was just a strong consensus throughout. And the only really tough debate was, of course, the one that led to the Civil War and therefore, the expansion of slavery. was the key question as we figured out which new states to bring in. And then, that made for some contentious decisions about what we did out west. But otherwise, there's just this remarkable degree of inevitability about a lot of our defense strategy because it was, for the first 120 years or so, really just focused on consolidating the country in what we tended to think were the natural borders. And even today, we have the temptation to think of these borders as our natural borders, which is why people still write articles about how the United States was isolationist for the first half of its history or more. And I think that's the last word in the world I would ever use to describe Americans. We were not isolationists. We started out a small swath of land on the eastern seaboard. And by the end of the next century, we controlled all the land, including your home state of Arizona and California. And that was not, for the most part, just by our good looks, charisma, charm, and diplomacy. It was quite often through force of arms that we got that land.
So I want to ask one more about the structure of your book before getting back into sort of our self-criticism and misconceptions about isolationism, and then we'll answer some questions from the audience as well. Um, you can you summarize? You sort of identify three main eras of grand strategy, and you title them expansionism for the first one, second one quasi-isolationism or regionalism, and then internationalism with sustained forward engagement. Could you expand on those and how you distilled on those, and were there any outliers that were troubling for you?
Well, first of all, the expansionism stuff we've been talking about, and so I
Mhm. Yes.
probably explained that enough. The interesting period from 1900 to 1940 is the second phase, and that's the phase, you could almost call it the schizophrenic phase in our history, where we were sort of trying to mind our own business most of the time, except here in the northern part of the Western Hemisphere, where we had the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and were quite interventionist throughout the whole period. But then we would get drawn into the world wars. And so we would just oscillate, up and down in terms of whether we were more or less minding our own business and maintaining a small army, or whether we were expanding enormously and then going and fighting the biggest wars of our history. So that's why I call that period a combination of regionalism and massive interventionism, which was punctuated, of course, by those two world wars. And then the third period is everything since 1945, or at least 1948, 49. Cold War had really dawned upon us, settled in, and we realized we had to worry about the Soviet threat, and that led to the system of alliances that we created and the rebuilding of a strong military. And we sort of never wavered from that. Now, in the early period, it was called containment, during the Cold War. And since that time, IR theorists look for different terms, deep engagement, but internationalism is really maybe the simplest one. And it's been a constant American involvement in global affairs, especially along the littoral of Eurasia. That's the place where we've decided our security interests are just too important ever to leave the security of those regions to somebody else. And we made that mistake twice, and we got two world wars as a result. And so far, even under President Trump, who sounded like an isolationist for a while, but really, in my opinion, is not, we still have all the alliances intact that he inherited back in 2017 or 2025. And so we've got, as you know, a big system of alliances in Europe, or one major alliance, a system of alliances in East Asia, and then a lot of strong security partnerships in the Middle East. Those are basically the three main regions of the world where we've just decided we have to stay engaged. We're not very involved in the same way in South or Southeast Asia, but of course we had a bad history there with Vietnam, and we tried for a while. So it really is, if you think about it, it's the littoral, the coastal regions of the giant landmass of Eurasia, where ever since 1945, we've decided we have to not let them mind their own business, but play a heavy role. And the Trump administration's trying to play a lesser role in Europe, but so far it really hasn't made any binding decisions in that direction. And it's tried to play a lesser role in the Middle East, like every previous president since Bill Clinton, maybe. But we keep getting sucked back into the Middle East and in Northeast Asia, and then down to Australia. we and the Philippines, we of course now see these countries as important assets in our rivalry with China and maybe potential victims of Chinese aggression. And so those alliances remain very important. And I think the Trump administration, which I generally don't support in many ways, has, to be fair, done a good job, including with Secretary Hegseth, in reinforcing, buttressing the alliances in East Asia.
So I'd like to go back to the misperception of a history of isolationism. And AHS, we've been talking a lot this year about misperceptions of our founders' isolationism, and some quotes that are often kind of cherry-picked to support an idea that once independent, the United States would draw itself in. For a lot of really good quintessentially American reasons that have to do with liberty and individualism, we are a quite self-critical nation, it strikes me, both regarding our grand strategy and how well our defense strategy supports it. And I wonder often if some of the exaggeration of our isolationist tendencies is born out of that self-criticism. And international relations is interesting because you can't know the road not taken. And your book is really cutting edge in my view because you have assigned criteria to both wartime and peacetime defense strategies, and you have, through both objective and subjective criteria, ranked them as varying degrees of success or failure. What was that experience like in looking at the holistic history of defense posture, and what are the main factors that you think contribute to our relative peacetime strategies being more successful than our wartime strategies?
Yeah, great. Let me first say one more word on this whole debate about isolationism, because one of my good friends and one of my favorite scholars is a guy named Charles Kupchan. Probably some of you know him, know his work. He's a professor at Georgetown, and he wrote a history of isolationism in the United States. And it's a good book. And he's a great scholar. There's a lot of rigor. I acknowledge that isolationism as an idea has always played a role in American debates. If you define isolationism to mean staying out of Eurasia's problems. However, two big caveats. First, we've never been isolationist in terms of the next place we could expand until we got all the way to the Pacific. And then we started getting restless and started building a big Navy and went to war against Spain and took Guam and the Philippines. We didn't do a lot of that kind of stuff, but we continued to expand. And then we built up our military muscle. And we didn't want to be in the world wars, but we did want to have a big Navy because we wanted to compete with all the big powers on Earth. So I don't think that maybe we're using the word isolationism in different ways. And maybe it's true that some people had a romanticized vision of just always getting away from those crazy Europeans and their monarchs and their wars and just building a North American paradise with a new form of government. So I would acknowledge in that sense, there's always been a current of thinking that wanted to avoid entanglement in Europe. But I don't call that isolationism because, again, I'm just being more literal. We started as a small swath of land along the Atlantic seaboard. And within 100 years, we're all the way out here. How is that possibly, in any proper sense of the word, isolationist? And moreover, even if the ideas were constantly informing our debates, the people who had power were constantly actually pushing west and then building up navies and then getting involved in world wars. So that's why I sort of reject this notion that Americans as a people, as a government, have ever really followed an isolationist mantra. Now getting to your actual question about these two different kinds of strategies. Well, I'm not really a political scientist. I got a policy degree from Princeton at the School of Public and International Affairs. I don't really call myself a political scientist. I'm a physicist by training. I like history more than I like political science. I read a fair amount of political science, but my point being, I wasn't looking in my final chapter to create some grand theory of everything. I was just trying to understand the history and sort of distill it. And so what I did in the final chapter of the book, having done the whole chronology of the 250 years, was to identify what I thought were fair descriptions of our military or defense strategies in peacetime and then the ones in wartime. And quite often for a war, there were two or three or four, because often we started with a bad strategy that was leading us towards failure and then had to change it, like in the Revolution or, for the Union and the Civil War. And then in peacetime, I said, how do you define defense strategy in peacetime, and how do you evaluate the success? And I said, well, in peacetime or relative peacetime, we're not fighting any big wars. You still might be doing smaller things, fighting smaller battles with your military. So how well are those going? And then secondly, how well are you preparing for possible future war if it happens? And then third, how are you hopefully reducing the odds of that future war through deterrence, assuming that we really don't want to be fighting most of the time and the war is bad if you can avoid it. So by those criteria, I went through and I looked at all the different defense strategies, and sometimes they would, in peacetime or relative peacetime, they could last with the same kind of basic approach for 10 or 20 or 30 years. But in wartime, then we would usually have faster changing military strategies. And so I wound up with about 20 strategies for each category, for big wars and then for all other periods in our history. And the big wars, if you think about it, depending on how you define big, but certainly Revolution, Civil War, World Wars, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, possibly War of 1812, Spanish-American, U.S.-Mexico War. So somewhere between like 8 and 12 wars with a combined duration of 40 years-ish. Maybe 50 if you count the full duration of Afghanistan. And then about 200 years when we were not engaged in big war. We were in relative peace, but Americans are never really fully at peace, either intellectually, mentally, emotionally, or militarily. And so, I just tried to describe each major defense strategy in peace or war as simply as I could, and then just tabulate them all, and then just look at it. I didn't run regressions. I didn't, because one problem with running regressions, why would I want to consider all the strategies equally important? Some of them produced our independence or restored our union or defeated the Nazis. And I would have to have a big debate with myself and others about what's the relative importance in any regression of those wars versus, the Spanish-American War or the Vietnam War. So I just didn't want to get into, that's where I think political science can get a little geeky, and a little arcane, is to spend too much time on these kinds of debates. Sometimes just learn the history, try to distill the history, and then debate the history. And with that process, I wound up concluding that if you looked, again, coming back to the 19th century, if you look at our history in relative peacetime, for the most part, the military did what was asked of it. It was able to consolidate the country, for example, in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, even before World War II, the grand strategy was isolationism or regionalism, and we did not allow the military to build up big forces. But within that constraint, that top-level constraint, the military did a very good job developing defense strategies on how to use aircraft carriers, how to conduct amphibious assault, how to use air power, which was coming into its own more effectively in any future war. So once we did get into World War II, we were ready with the right ideas. And then we had the industry that could rapidly produce the equipment we needed. And we turned the tide in World War II really quite fast compared to the head start we had, given the Nazis and the Tojo regime in Japan. So I would say the defense strategy of the 1930s was much better than the grand strategy. So these are the kinds of things I did in that discussion. Tried to identify major strategies. Now, one last thing and I'll stop. In the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, these were relatively less important for our country than the Revolution, the Civil War, World War II. But we went through, because those wars were so long, especially Afghanistan, we went through a lot of different strategies. So out of my, I think it was 24 wartime strategies throughout our history, maybe a half dozen of them came out of Afghanistan because we had a half dozen different ways of fighting that war. Or maybe it's just because I lived that war, not as a soldier, but as a scholar and as a researcher and traveler to Afghanistan. Maybe I was just a little bit too much in the weeds myself. As an author, I have to allow for that possibility. But we did change strategy a lot. And so the United States has been lucky so far that often if we get off to a bad start in a war, we can recover because the wars usually happen a long ways away. We've got a big resource base. We've got all those fish protecting us that you mentioned earlier. And so that's one more theme that emerges from my final chapter is that our wartime strategies have only been successful by my count about 2/3 of the time. But even when they were unsuccessful at first, we often had an opportunity to recover.
So I'd like to ask you one question about what is striking to you about current events, specifically about hemisphere defense. Um, Current events in Venezuela and our engagement there. How did hemisphere defense evolve into a power projection beyond that to where you're talking about a relative peacetime era being of a great power piece, but still including conflict within our own hemisphere? What is striking to you after the process of writing this book about our hemisphere now?
Well, please don't take this as a defense of Donald Trump. But what strikes me maybe most is that he does, in fact, sound like somebody who wants his own corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And give him and his team credit that some of them know their history well enough to hear the echoes from the Theodore Roosevelt corollary of 1904 or the original Monroe Doctrine of 1823, where the United States has basically been saying to everybody else, we're going to be the boss of our neighborhood, and others better keep their mitts off. And of course, in 1823, we had no real way to enforce that. And President Monroe's dictum was intended to cover the entire Western Hemisphere. By contrast, Theodore Roosevelt and now Donald Trump, with much more powerful American militaries at their disposal, have been somewhat less ambitious than President Monroe and have focused on the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, down to the northern coast of South America. And even in the early decades of the 20th century, when we had these periods of grand strategic isolationism or quasi-isolationism, we were never quiet here in our own neighborhood. And Theodore Roosevelt, first of all, helped Panama break off from Colombia so we could build the Panama Canal. He articulated his Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He built up a bigger navy, which had begun already by his predecessors. He intervened, and his successors intervened in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Mexico, to be sure, on top of the Panama intervention that I mentioned earlier. And then we had the Spanish-American War prior to that, where we obviously drove the Spanish out of Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so Donald Trump sort of knows his history. Now, I would argue that history is not always the prettiest part of our past. And also, it was in a different era when the great powers were more, in many cases, imperialistic. We were more sort of paternalistic. We wanted, a say over things happening close to home. We didn't necessarily want to expand the country further after 1900. But, what worked in that period or what was considered allowable in that period, I don't think is allowable anymore. When humans have created the world wars, these kind of behaviors that even Theodore Roosevelt was partly guilty of are what led us to the great power rivalries that produced World War I and World War II in many ways. So I don't think we should ever go back to that. It's dangerous. And in that sense, I'm not a supporter of everything Trump's done. Now, in regard to the Venezuela operation specifically, however, it's a little more complicated because, of course, I'm not going to say anything good about President Maduro, bad guy, and a guy who was bad for his own people. And, there was this doctrine 25 years ago called the responsibility to protect that basically said to bad leaders like Saddam Hussein or, other people who were genocidal towards their own citizens, the international community has an interest in the well-being of people, and we're not going to let you hide behind sovereignty. Now, the debate back then was supposed to require the UN Security Council or the international community in some broader sense to make decisions on humanitarian intervention, whereas Trump just did it all by himself, just decided to go snatch Maduro. So I don't defend that decision in terms of international law, but I would acknowledge that Maduro was a bad guy. I would acknowledge that Trump is acting in the tradition of many previous American presidents towards the near abroad. And I would also conclude by saying Trump seems to have also learned a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan that we don't want to go in with a big nation building effort. And so he's going to try to use this combination of inducements and implied threats and pressure on acting President Delcy Rodriguez to try to push the new Venezuelan government or the new Venezuelan leadership, since it's really the same government, but just decapitated at the top, try to push them into somewhat better behavior on narcotics and on self-governance. And if he can get that result, I'll have a hard time arguing with the overall bottom line. I think it was a violation of international law. I would have advised against it in a decision-making meeting at the Situation Room. But to be fair and stay analytical, if Trump can somehow induce this new government to behave a little bit better, then the whole thing doesn't look quite so bad. And it certainly has a lot of historical antecedents.
So I'm going to do 3 questions from our audience. The first is across your case, the first concerns coalition building. Across your case studies, World War II to Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, what patterns do you see in how the U.S. has managed coalition partnerships? Have we gotten better or worse at coalition warfare over time? And what is your prognosis going forward as we see global coalitions under threat, but still parts of key advancements? And then there's a specific note about what do you think about Canadian Prime Minister Carney's recent statements in Davos about a multilateral approach to partnerships based on allied interest? So broad question on history of U.S. success with coalitions and how you see that today with our allies.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think some of the best coalitions were in World War II for sure. And that was a more limited coalition where there were a few partners, but it was pretty clear that Britain was far and away our most important, Canada also important, the Australians and others. But you sort of had a clear pecking order about how to start the Allied decision-making based on overall resources. And then, of course, we were in general alliance with Joseph Stalin, but for the most part, we're fighting wars in separate theaters and doing so more or less separately, except for American weaponry contributing to a lot of the Soviet military machine. I think George H.W. Bush did a great job in Desert Storm. But again, it was sort of a very clear pecking order. U.S. dominance, important role for Britain, a couple others, and then lesser roles for a lot of other countries, but still grateful for the, solidarity as much as for the fighting power. There are other times, more recently, we obviously lost the Afghanistan war despite having a huge coalition and the world's greatest alliance in history as actually leading the operation. So coalitions don't guarantee you success by any means. And having known a few of the commanders of the International Security Assistance Force and its successor missions in Afghanistan, I know how much time they had to spend trying to please 30 or 40 coalition partners, deal with their visiting parliamentarians and heads of state, integrating them into battle plans, and that one verged on inefficiency and maybe even distraction, such that the top leadership, both military and civilian and political, spent more time on coalition management than on thinking, well, how well are we really doing and how strong is our strategy? Because like I said a minute ago, we wound up having about a half dozen strategies in Afghanistan, partly because they were so flawed at every step along the way. And maybe we would have been better advised to have a smaller coalition with a few key players that we could really just have serious strategy debates with instead of spending so much time on coalition management. So that's just one set of observations. In terms of Prime Minister Carney, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of the Canadians. In addition to growing up right next to Canada, my first trip to Afghanistan was with Canadians, and we visited them in Kandahar in 2008, where they had been given a nearly impossible task of trying to control that, hotbed of Taliban activity with just a couple thousand troops. They were doing so with great bravery and commitment, and they've put up with a lot of crap from us in the last year. And so my hat's off to them. And I don't blame Prime Minister Carney for being frustrated or for trying to look to a world that might be less characterized by a reliable United States. Having said all that, I'm not a complete fan of the speech for 2 big reasons. One, I don't think we should presuppose that the United States has gone away from its traditional role. I mean, we're on the verge of that. And certainly Trump has made a lot of people worry that we're headed there. But sometimes it's useful to look at Asia, where under Shinzo Abe in the first Trump presidency and now other Japanese leaders, including Prime Minister Takaichi, that in a way, the Japanese, the Koreans, others have figured out that the best way to deal with Trump is not to blow everything up into a big debate and not to challenge him head on, but to find a way to maneuver him back to a path that is less fundamentally objectionable. And I think a lot of European allies have learned how to do this, including NATO Secretary General Rutte, where the whole Greenland idea, this crazy notion of the United States seizing and annexing Greenland, looked really problematic a couple of weeks ago, and it may still in the future for all I know. But the Europeans found a way to sort of cajole Trump back towards an alternative way of achieving some of the same goals he had been after, and not forcing him to back down in a direct, embarrassing way. Prime Minister Carney, by contrast, got in Trump's face a little bit, and I don't blame him. And, it takes a lot of patience, I'm sure, to handle President Trump when he gets these grandiose ideas and he gets into his bluster and his self-centeredness. But usually the best way to handle that is what I call strategic jujitsu. Use his moves to, against him a little bit, or judo, if you will, and deflect them. Only have the head-on confrontation when you really need to. And don't over-dramatize the damage that's already been done. You can call attention to the danger. Like, it was fine for people to say that Trump's putting NATO at risk with his desire for Greenland. I think that was an accurate analysis. But to say we're already now in a multipolar world where you can't depend on the United States the way you used to, I would just not advise people to say that right now, because I don't think it's yet been proven to be true. And until it's irreversibly occurred, we can still hope to walk a lot of things back. So that would be my reaction to the Carney speech in Davos.
Okay, so I have two more questions, which I'm going to give you in sequence from our audience. The first is, as it relates to military readiness and defense modernization, when we look across the conflicts of our history, is there a war or a campaign that offers the most relevant lessons for today's strategic environment? And the second is somewhat civil military relations and force structure. Going back to the revolution, the evolution from a militia model to the all-volunteer force, what have you found the implications of having a career American soldiers?
So on the first, I think the most informative period in some ways is the Cold War, not for the battles we fought, but for the war we didn't fight, the war we succeeded in preventing. And it was through a system of alliances, permanent stationing of U.S. military forces, treaties, and all of this together creating a credibility about where we would fight. And then, of course, maintaining a strong military to back up those claims and those, pronouncements. So, and ultimately, we succeeded without firing a shot, at least against the Soviet Union or China. Well, of course, we did fight China at the very beginning in the Korean War, and we saw a few Chinese here and there in Vietnam, but we didn't have the big showdown against either one. And so our greatest success was in not having to have World War III. And I think that is also true now going forward. By the way, I did a short section in my final chapter reassessing whether there is such a thing as an American way of war. I don't know how many people on the call today are familiar with the great Russell Weigley's book, The American Way of War. It was written about a half century ago by one of our great military historians who's since passed away. But he argued that the American way of war, especially since the Civil War, was to apply massive firepower in pursuit of an unconditional surrender or annihilation of the enemy. And I sort of quibbled with that, partly because I had 50 more years of history to work with than he did. And in the course of those 50 years, the United States succeeded in winning the Cold War without fighting the Soviet Union or China. And that was a military accomplishment in large part. It wasn't a combat accomplishment, but it was in part a military accomplishment because the credibility of our deterrence sort of held the line until economic and other trends could lead to our Western success in the Cold War. And so I think that's the right model. And heaven forbid we ever fight a war of annihilation against Russia or China, because we're all going to get annihilated in all probability if that happens. So that's my overall answer to the first question. On the all volunteer force, it's fascinating to go back and look at how it was created. It was really created partly because the country politically was sick of the draft after Vietnam, or at the very tail end of Vietnam. It wasn't created initially to create this magnificent professionalized military that had people usually with several years of experience who wanted to be there in uniform. It became that during the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. In the 70s, it was not yet that. And that was not really the original motivation. So I think we've done very well with the all-volunteer force, and I would be very hesitant to mess with it. But there are reasons to worry about it. And one of them, of course, is that now we only have about 0.5% of the country that's serving in the military at any given moment. And there's a greater divide, therefore, between the military and society, especially knowing that a lot of that military personnel comes out of military families. So there's a tradition in certain pockets of the country of military service. And then for many of the rest of us, it's not even a thing we contemplate. So my thought would be not to go back to any possibility of conscription, at least not anytime soon that I could foresee, but to think about national service, whether it's obligatory or highly incentivized, with military service as one of the options. And my good friend, one of the great generals of our time, Stanley McChrystal, worked with Michelle Obama and others on this concept 10 years ago, trying to really promote national service and incentivize it and get it to be much more popularized. I was a Peace Corps volunteer myself, by the way. I wasn't in the military. And I think, Peace Corps certainly counts. AmeriCorps certainly counts. Teach for America, these kinds of things. We should really try to create a culture where more of us are doing this at some point in our young adult lives. And if we have that, then I think we'll have more people consider military service as well. It'll probably still be a modest fraction of the total, but it will help rebuild some of these bridges between our professional military, which is sometimes, again, a little bit sheltered off from the rest of the country, and then the whole of society.
All right, Michael, thank you so much for joining us and for being a great friend of AHS. Continue, everybody, to dare mighty things. Pick up your copy soon. It's a great encapsulation of 250 years of our defense history as we reflect on our and pontificate on our next 250. So thank you so much, Michael.
Great being with you all. And sorry about the early words about Alexander Hamilton's complex legacy in some circles, but it illustrates sort of the energy and restlessness of this nation, those early debates. And it was fun to be able to share some of that with you today.
No sorry necessary. His legacy speaks for itself and will continue to last if we have anything to say about it. So thank you so much, Michael. We'll see you soon.
See you.